Welcome to lesson 7, and we'll be talking about writing REST API. So now we'll talk about the REST API guidelines and setting up API in Express. We'll now separate the application server from the API server, and we're gonna do get methods for us one of our APIs. Okay, we would examine the rules. Okay, and we are now focusing on the API server. Okay, so REST is again an architectural style. One important part is it should be stateless. API allows applications to talk to one another, right? So for MeanStack, stateless interface to your database enables other application to work with the data. So the request and response, right? Um, for example, the application sends in a request. The REST API server would take that incoming HTTP request and would do some processing, and then now it would talk to the database if necessary, and then after that, it would now send back an HTTP response, right? And it should always give a response back to not leave the application hanging or the user hanging, right? So Crud Operations, we already know this. We create, read, update, and delete. And just putting this in a tabular format where we have the action that we wanted and the URL path and the example URL, right? In the example URL, we now would like to include the API as part of the base URL, right? So the user would know that it's interacting with an API server, okay? And we have the bunch of request methods. We already have the post, get, put, and delete. Post basically writes to the database. It creates a new data in the database, right? And it would give a response back to the requester, meaning the application that interacted with the REST API server, to get that new data object that was written to the database, right? The get request would just read from the database and show back the data from the request, right? The requested resource. For the put, it's similar to post, but instead of creating a new data, it would update a document in the database, and it also would show it as a response back to the application to confirm. Delete would just delete the object from the database, and response is null. Okay, with the corresponding methods, right? You would have the URL path and the example full URL, right? And just adding that now with when you're interacting with, let's say, subdocuments, right? So if you want to create a new review, you first need to access the list of locations and then a specific location, and now the reviews of that specific location, right? Um, Now, if you want to read a specific, you just need to add the review ID, update the specific, a review ID, and delete the specific, a review ID. So there's two images here. As I mentioned, the right hand side, you don't leave the application hanging, right? You should give back a response, right? And usually there's return data and an HTTP status code, a 200 for OK, right? So the typical format for REST API are XML and or JSON. JSON has faster response time as it's being used, and it's used throughout the main stack as well. Right? Your API will return one to three things for each request. The JSON object answering the request query. So if you request for, let's say, a location, you would get a, let's say, that specific location in a JSON object format, right? A JSON object containing error data if there's any error at all, and a null response as well for delete. And here are the status codes that you should add to your controller as part of your response, right? So the 200 and the 404 and Usually those are the most used, the 200, 201, and 404. Setting up the API in Express, you would define routes, controller, right? And you separate the API code to avoid confusion and complication, right? You would create the routes in the application, specify the request methods in the routes, and the required URL parameters, defining the Locator application API routes, right? You now need to create an additional routes for your API. You have the index router. You now have to add the API router, right? And you would point that to a different folder. It's the app_API, right? And you would also define, right, which router to go to when it starts with a /API. So it's like a catch-all for all /API. Okay. So specifying a router after you created a router object, yes, you now have to have the get a method. A get method needs a parameter, the URL, and next is the controller and the function for that controller, right? And you can also use other methods such as post, right? And then put the URL in the first parameter, and the second parameter would be the controller file and the controller function, right? Again, we exported controller locations. That's why we are able to use that in this file. Okay, suppose you're trying to access a view with the ID ABC that belongs to a location with an ID 123. You would have a URL like this, and you would have the location ID review ID be changed with at the bottom should be /API/location/ with the location 123 and review ABC. So this has to be corrected. Review ABC. Okay. Right. So defining the Locator API routes, we'll go from top to bottom. The first one is requiring Express. So you have Express object and requiring router, right? I mean adding router so that you have a router object. And then now you want to include the controller locations and controller reviewers, right? And then now for your locations, you have a router, right? For all the locations, right? For the /location, you can get all the locations by distance. And also with the same URL path with that route, you can create a single location, right? For this other router wherein you specify the location ID, you can get one location, you can update one location, and you can delete one location. Okay, going to the reviews, it needs to have the location and the specific location, right? For you to be able to create a review. And then if the other one, the last one here is you need a specific review ID as well to do the get, put, and delete. Okay, creating placeholder stops the application from failing over while building the API functionality. So if it's your first time building the certain API or the functionality, you can just create this constant variable name and then this anonymous function, callback function, request response, and an empty body, right? So that's a placeholder, so you can just test it right away. So you would want to test first that you're expected it to fail, right? And then now write the logic to your controller function, right? Don't forget to export your placeholder functions as well so that other files and code base can access that one. Okay, and remember to add responses to test it. Okay, so let's say response that status and give the status. Response also respond back also with the JSON and the content, right? So here's an example where you would want to, let's say, put a 200 there and the JavaScript object with the status success. So here's plugging that in, right? And again, this is in the controllers, right? So including the model, so the API should be able to talk to the database to be useful. So we start with creating a mongoose object, right? The mongoose can now create a model location, right? And now we move the models away from the app server to the app API. Okay, now you can do a quick test and make sure you start it with npm start or maybe node app.js, whichever works. And then now you can check your browser to get that response. You can also do a curl request here to get the exact same response or postman, right? As you can see here with the postman, you can easily test it with postman as the word postman is. You try to do a post, put, delete. The get methods again, the three get methods for the our API would be get all locations, get a single location, and then get a single review, a specific review. So with Mongoose, instead of creating our MongoDB query statement, right, we can just create use this Mongoose query methods like the find by ID, find one. So it makes it easier, right? So find by ID looks for the ID and checks for that. That's it. Running query against the execute method, right? So it executes a query and passes a callback function that will run when the operation is complete. And callback function should accept two parameters, an error object and the instance of the found document. Okay. So the error is basically the catch, right? So it can give back the error so that it can pass back to the controller, right? Also with the location. So let's start with this. So we have the lock, and as we go back, the lock is your model, right? We created the, wow, that's far away already, but we're here. Like, lock is the model that you specified. Once you have the model, you can now use the find by ID and the location ID, right? And then you want to execute that query statement, okay? And remember, you need this callback function. You can have any names here, but the first parameter would be the error object, and the second would be used for the data. Okay. We need the location ID. We already mentioned that. Next. Okay. So, in our controller, we have a callback function that would give a request and response, take in a request and response. In this case, it will do a response. The reason why, because it's taking in requests, right? And then process that request and will give back a response, okay? And as you can see, if you go at the bottom first, right? If this completes, let's give a response, right? Okay, so the second line here, the model location, which is lock. Let's prepare this query statement. This that params that location ID, it means that if an application requested to the API server, it will now grab the request body, right? The parameters from that, the request URL, right? You would say, because in the URL you would see the certain location ID there, right? So it would pass by here, right? So in short, you would have the ID, let's say last time it's 123, right? So it would use the 123 here. And then let's execute that statement. Okay? If we didn't find that specific location, maybe it didn't really exist in the database, right? This is the if statement for that. If location does not exist in database, let's return a response. Let's return a status code of 404 not found and a JSON object, right? With this message, location not found, right? Okay. So this is if we don't find the location. If there's other errors, right, we would catch that with the else if error and return a response 404 and whatever the error was. Okay? If we did not encounter any error and the location is there, then we'll return this okay and also return the location object. Okay. So finding a single subdocument based on IDs. To find the subdocument, definitely you need to find the parent document first, right? So an example with this one, the parent is the players, right? And let's say the subdocument is a player, right? So to access that, you need the, let's say, outside of this, there's teams.player, and then the ID. Going back, Mungus also offers a helper method for finding a subdocument by ID, right? So first, you want to find the parent ID of the location. Then, once it sees that location, it can select a specific property, right? Or that property is a subdocument, let's say name reviews, right? And if it's find that's review, let's execute, right? Then we want to execute using the specific review ID as well. So summary, we learned the REST API, including URLs, request method, and response code. How the post, get, put, and delete, only the get for this time around. HTTP request method map to common CRUD operations. Okay, we'll continue on to the next lesson after this.